This episode was first recorded in November 2017, before the launch of Journey to the Savage Planet and before Typhoon Studios was bought out by Google. Alex Hutchinson, what is your favourite game?
My favourite game is Exile. I was very lucky. I grew up with a dad who was a bit of a gadget head, so he had every computer under the sun from basically the mid '80s. So we had everything from a K-Pro to a strange Australian only PC system called a Microbeat, which had some games on it, mostly sort of monochromatic, strange rip-off titles from better systems I didn't know at the time. And then eventually he graduated to buying me a Nintendo Entertainment System, an NES back in the day, and that was the first exposure to, I think, sort of really good games. And from there it just exploded. But my favorite system is the Amiga 500. So I spent thousands of hours on my glorious Amiga, which if anyone is listening from America, they probably have no idea what it is, but the European and Australian contingents will remember.
What game can you remember, like, you were having the time of your life with the Amiga, anyways, like, besides Exile?
No, I mean, there's just so many. I mean, SimCity on the Amiga was fantastic. Civilization 2 on the Amiga was fantastic. All the Bitmap Brothers stuff. Some of them were, more graphics than content, but Gods, Chaos Engine were brilliant. Sensible Software were amazing. So, Sensible Soccer, Cannon Fodder. Some of the early Molyneux stuff was great. So, Populous and Powermonger were terrific. There's just so many titles on that system that, at least for me, were brand new. Not only video games, but sometimes even entire genres. That it was a seminal system.
You mentioned the early Molyneux stuff. What about Syndicate as well?
Syndicate's terrific. I really like Syndicate. In fact, there's Tokyo 42. I don't know if you've played it recently. Just came out, which has a lot of the DNA of that early Syndicate sort of top-down gameplay. But yeah, it was really, really cool little game.
Yeah, I know it's out there. I still yet to play, to be honest. I have actually quite a lot of games through this year I still yet to need to play, and I'm locking down my goodie list today once Life is Strange comes out.
Oh, there you go. I really enjoyed the first one. I haven't played the prequel.
Prequel's very good. Surprisingly good, considering the question that there was any need for a prequel, but you know what? It's actually justified its existence. I really enjoyed the prequel. It's really good.
Okay. Nice.
There you go. There's something new for you to sort out now for the end of the year. I was going to say as well, what about the Syndicate shooter from Starbreeze a few years ago? How did you find that?
I think, I never understand sometimes the business approach to licenses. If it's a title with a strong following, then you would think that it's worth keeping to the DNA that brought it that strong following. And if it's a title that doesn't have a strong following, why do you want to glue the name of a dead franchise to your new game? So I don't really get the idea of turning a top-down isometric mouse-based shooter into a first-person shooter in an industry which is packed with first-person shooters. So I didn't actually look at it. I decided to leave my memories unsullied.
Fair enough. I can totally get that, but I actually really enjoyed Syndicate. It was a really good shooter. I really enjoyed it. It wasn't obviously the be-all, end-all like Call of Duty or Battlefield or anything like that there, but like it was rather enjoyable. And I say that as someone who admittedly has not played the older Molyneux Syndicate games, but I really enjoyed it. It was really fun, anyways.
Yeah, but that's cool. But I mean, then you would have enjoyed it regardless of what it was called. And clearly, you didn't pick it up because it was called Syndicate. So it just seems like a sort of a barnacle stuck on the side of the game.
All right, that's true. That is admittedly true. So, yeah, I could have probably played that game under a different name, and it still would have been a decent shooter. So I can see your point now. So from after the Amiga days, like how was your kind of gaming perspective after
After that one, well, I took a little bit of a break after the Amiga, and was deep in the guts of university back in Australia. So didn't play much until the PlayStation 1 came out, and then it's just basically been a steady stream. So it was PlayStation 1, Nintendo 64, and pretty much every system since then to some degree. Probably spent a lot of time with my Dreamcast back in the day. And recently it's been, Xbox 360, Xbox One for me. So yeah, I've trolled across most systems over the years.
What were the first games you were playing when you came back into gaming again, like with the PS1 Dreamcast?
The PS1, the thing that pulled me back in weirdly was sort of Tekken 3 blew me away. I got in a bit before that, but the stuff that really surprised me, Resident Evil 2, Tekken 3, a lot of the Japanese stuff in those days, with the really impressive games both across the PlayStation and the early PlayStation and the Dreamcast, which is funny because I think they've struggled more recently, with bigger teams and sort of and bigger titles outside of a few standouts like Square seems to still be able to manage, and it's become the best stuff sort of coming out of the West. But back when I got really back into games, then it was all Japan all the time.
What other Japanese games were kind of stand out to you at that time, like Tekken and?
There's Tekken, big franchises, the Tekken, Final Fantasies, but I mean even they were doing really sort of interesting little stuff like things coming out of Namco and Konami and that sort of stuff, like or Metal Gear Solid at the time wasn't little, but games like Tomba as well were really interesting. So they were putting out a lot of quality games. So I started out writing for video games. I was in Melbourne, Australia, so it was a long way from any of the big sort of industry hubs of Japan or London or California. So I figured it was pretty much impossible to get onto the development teams anywhere. So I was writing articles for magazines. So I did the odd article for Edge magazine or various PC gaming magazines back mostly in the UK. And then at a certain point, someone sent me a link to a job advertisement for a game designer, which was amazing because I didn't actually know what the job was, and I think it was probably in the earliest days of that even being a job. So, before that, most things were designed by the lead engineer, essentially, whoever was coding the game. And I was fortunate enough to get given a shot at a very small company called Taurus Games, which was way out of town, like an hour and a half on a train each way, making sort of Game Boy games for licenses as fast as humanly possible. So it was a great place to learn, but not a great place to make great games. So then I was in there, I met some people who ended up going to EA, and they said I really should apply there. And I was lucky enough to get picked up by Maxis to come across. At the time, they'd said they wanted me to work on a console version of SimCity, which I was really, really excited about, which managed to get cancelled on the plane while I was in the air. So by the time I landed, I had an immediate meeting where they said, do you want to go home now? Is that do you still want the job? Which was an interesting question considering I just sold all of my furniture and broken my lease and left the country. But I was like, for sure, whatever you guys need me to do, I'll do. So I ended up working on a bunch of Sims games for console as a lead designer, and then moving across to be lead designer on Spore for a PC with Will Wright, which was fantastic. And then I took a creative director gig at EA Montreal, where I worked on Army of Two, the 40th Day, and then went to Ubisoft, where most recently I was creative director on Assassin's Creed 3 and Far Cry 4.
Before we move on to your favourite game, there's actually one thing that I'm kind of curious about your time at Ubisoft.
Mm-hmm.
And I don't know if you can answer it, but you mentioned a few years ago that you were working on something small scale, kind of similar to Child of Light and Valiant Hearts. Like, I'm guessing that it was obviously cancelled, but like, have you ever revealed what that game was going to be?
I'm not allowed to talk about it just because it actually isn't cancelled at the moment. So, like at the end, we had a parting of ways. So I've, as some people may know, started up a new game studio here in Montreal called Typhoon Studios. And we're hard at work on our first game, but at the end of my tenure at Ubisoft, we had a difference of opinion about which direction that game should go in. So as far as I know, it is still being worked on. Although in what direction and by whom, I'm not so sure. But it will be a very bizarre experience one day to be able to play a game that that myself and a bunch of close friends initiated for a couple of years and then has taken on a life of its own. But we will see.
Let's talk of your favorite game, Exile, and this is going to be a bit of an one of those games where I am completely clueless. Well, not completely clueless. I've done a tiny bit of homework on, so you can give me the elevator pitch on what Exile is. So, like, if I had somehow found an Amiga 500 today and I managed to get the game up and running, give me an elevator pitch on why I should play Exile and what it is.
Yeah, so Exile is actually originally published on the BBC Micro and the Acorn Electron in 1988 by a little company called Superior Software. And the version that I played, which I think is the sort of audio-visual spectacular version of it, was ported to the Amiga 500, in the early 90s. The two big elements that really blew me away at the time. It was designed by two guys, Peter Irvin and Jeremy Smith, in the days when you could actually name check the people who made video games. One is that it's a sort of an early Metroidvania. So the game is basically you will land on the surface of the planet on your little spaceship. It's a side-scrolling 2D game, and you can essentially go in any direction from the very, very start. You need to find gear, upgrade your gear, and it will give you access to other areas of the map. And you have a basic physics model to sort of thrust your little man around. So it has two things which fascinate me still to this day, and I think still are the core of why, say, the latest Zelda, Breath of the Wild, was terrific, which is a sense of freedom and a sense of openness and a core mechanic that's built around physics and player skill that's very elastic and powerful for the player to play with.
So you mentioned that kind of sense of freedom, and what, like, for a game of its time, like Exile, like, how was that like, especially considering now it is such a part of the bread and butter aspect of games, but back then, like, it was such a, what's the word I'm looking for? Such a not outside the norm, anyways.
So no, I think it's if you look back on it, it pops up on a lot of people's best of lists periodically. But according to Wikipedia, it wasn't released outside of Europe. I managed to get a copy somehow in Australia, perhaps from the back of various magazines with mail order coupons. But it was hugely influential amongst a very small group of players, even though it was eventually released across a lot of systems, from the BBC Micro to the Commodore 64, Amiga 500, Atari ST. I think even the CD32 had a version very late in the day, in the mid-90s.
What was the difficulties in trying to get new games for your Amiga at the time, living in Australia?
It was pretty crazy. Like, there were a bunch of sort of, high street shops that would carry bits and pieces, but I ended up actually importing a lot from the UK. So I would grab Mum's credit card and ring up shops in the UK who would post things out, and I would camp out by the mailbox for 2 months while it came across on, like, God knows what, a steamship or something across from the UK. So it was a pain in the butt to get some, but I used to read Amiga Power like a book every month, and make lists of things that I wanted and figure out cunning ways to get them.
Yeah, I was just going to say as well, like, it must have been really expensive as well.
Oh, it was hideous. Like, yeah, it was at that time. I mean, piracy was a huge problem towards the end of the Amiga, and part of that was because the pricing was just out of whack. Like, sometimes back then it was still $80 or $90 for a game in Australia. Which is crazy, considering the sort of the depth and breadth of some of those early titles, where you could pick a game up, go home, and finish it that evening, and it was $80 for a 12-year-old at the time was outrageous.
Jesus, especially considering the exchange rate as well. That must have been, God.
Yeah, well, that's what it was. I think it was like they were all like £25, £30, and so yeah, at that time that ended up as $80.
Fuck hell. And like you said, they only lasted for like a few hours, anyways.
Yeah, so some of them were deliberately managing difficulty by or longevity, I should say, by massive difficulty spikes. But yeah, a lot of them were pretty short, which is why when you found a game like Civilization 2 or SimCity that you could replay over and over, these were your go-to games. You didn't want to spend $80 and be done in 3 hours.
Oh no. Dear. $80 for a 3-hour game. Imagine the outrage today.
Oh yeah, the internet would explode.
Oh god. Hell, if I remember correctly, there was a bit of an outrage for The Witness being $30, and that was like a 100-hour game or something. I was like, how dare, or something like that. There, it was the kind of outrage. How dare that be $30 for a 100-hour game? Like,
yeah, no, it's because I remember Conker's Bad Fur Day on the Nintendo 64 was $120 in Australia. So that's probably the most still to this day the most I've ever spent on a game that was some weird Japanese import that you couldn't get that I had to hunt down. Just actually in a store putting down $120. That was pretty crazy.
God, that is insane. that especially like that wasn't a collector's edition as well. That was a standard copy.
Yeah, it's a standard copy. The rumor at the time, from memory, was that it had, because it was Nintendo had dropped it and Rare were sort of semi-self-publishing it, that the cart needed more memory actually in it. So the thing was pretty heavy. Remember, it felt like a brick.
Wow, that's actually really surprising considering if my memory recalls, the cartridge for the N64 was not light, but it was kind of semi-light. But when you put it like that, it's almost like I can just hurl this at someone's window and it'll smash. All the fun. All the youth. There you go. For all the youth who need brick smashing advice, go pick up a Conker's Bad Fur Day for your vandalising needs.
Yep.
Don't actually do that. Please don't actually do that. I don't want to. No, don't do that. We mentioned about how you played early Molyneux games and stuff like Syndicate, and obviously with Exile, it is a sci-fi driven game. Did you have much of a sci-fi obsession at that time?
Yeah, I've always been a huge sci-fi fan. Most of my favorite authors were like Philip K. Dick is probably still my favorite author. And so yeah, I was just trawling through early golden age sci-fi. Got really into sort of your William Gibson, your Bruce Sterling, sort of the cyberpunk guys. And so yeah, like games like Syndicate, which were you could really feel the sort of Gibson-esque influence on those were super hot at the time.
Like what other kind of games do you think at that time were kind of really pushing sci-fi forward besides Exile and Syndicate?
I think Chaos Engine, the Bitmap Bros I mentioned earlier, was a really great. It was more like a steampunky sort of universe, but it had that sort of sci-fi edge to it, which was a really great game. There were some 2D shooters back then. I mean, another Bitmap Bros game, Xenon 2, Mega Blast. That was a pretty good one. But it was a really broad spread of games. Like I think one of the joys of it not costing quite as much to develop, games and being able to, get them to market a little bit faster is you could take a few more risks in terms of the type of content you were building. Our dev cycles these days are 2 years to 3 years on a big game, and you could knock out a solid game in 3 to 6 months back on the Amiga. So you weren't covering that much or carrying that much risk. Your team wasn't as big. So if you had a crazy idea, you could push it through. You
could go as big as you could with the ambition, but the risk was a lot less minimal than it was then, because nowadays you got big budgets, big marketing, stuff like that there.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, there still does, but like the difference between spending $100 million on a game and needing to get that money back to keep the company alive, and to get there managing 400 to 700 people on the team. Just the scale of risk is so much greater than an Amiga game, which could be made by 4 to 10 people in 3 to 6 months. It just it's just a different ball game these days.
Just imagine like 4 to 10 people making an Amiga game 30 odd years ago compared to now with a 400, 800 people team making something like Mass Effect or Assassin's Creed or something like that. There, it's just mind-boggling how much of philosophy games development has changed even in the past 30 years.
Oh yeah, it's incredible, and I think you see it in a lot of those early, Amiga guys did really really well out of their games, and if they had a hit, the team, there's still devs who are spending money they made in the 90s, and are able to maintain decent lifestyles. But these days, yeah, it's much more of a business on the high end. It's a lot more like directing a Hollywood movie than it is making an Amiga game these days.
You mentioned well, you actually didn't, but there was someone who sprung to mind when you mentioned how there's still some people living off money coming in from the 90s, and there was a name that came to mind in regards to what you said, and that was, and maybe I'm misinterpreting what you said, but I was thinking of David Braben of Frontier, and obviously Elite and all that there, and like, whereas Elite was this big spaceship pioneering, like, exploring all sorts, Exile, at least from what I've read of it, and even what I've seen of it on YouTube, feels like a sort of single player-esque Elite sort of inspiration.
It's got a little bit of that. I mean, it's definitely single player.
Yeah.
Which is, so for me, it was much more immersive, and it didn't feel vast. It felt very sort of personalizing, contained. It had a physics model, as I mentioned earlier. It sort of had fire and electricity modeled in there, so it felt like there was a lot going on under the hood, which was really exciting. But yeah, never gained the sort of acclaim that Elite did by any stretch. One of the sad side notes is one of the developers, Jeremy Smith, died a few years after it was made, so it was actually his last game. So sometimes I wonder if it would have done a bit better if he'd sort of continued on that sort of line of work and built on the ideas that he had in the game.
Speaking personally, like, have you played Elite Dangerous at all recently?
I did play a little bit. I goofed around with it. I've never been a huge sort of space flight sim guy, so I played around with it, and I was super impressed by what they built initially, but also by how they've been managing that game and growing their audience and keeping it alive and building their game out from a small team making in the end a lot of content. So I think they've been doing a really terrific job with it.
I think for me, like you said, I can definitely appreciate and respect what they did with it, and like you said, I was goofing around with it as well. But at the same time, it's for an Elite newbie, let's say, it's very intimidating as well.
Yeah, it's a bit like, there's some games where you come up, it's hard to balance the different types of players you might have, where they're fans of the franchise for many years, and they're accustomed to the terminology and the sort of requirements of the gameplay, and then new players will just bounce off the front of it. So finding that way to ease new players in while still satisfying your hardcore players is always a challenge.
That's a good point to go on there. What do you think were the challenges in trying to get Exile across to players? Like, this is something that we can do better, or not even better, but something that helps us stand apart from Elite.
Yeah, I think Exile was a game that didn't tutorialize itself, that's just sort of dumped you in it. So I'd be willing to bet that a big percentage of its players just bounced right off the surface, that never actually realized the sort of hidden depths of the game, which is a shame. But it's also part of the magic of it for me, because it's a sense of discovery. In a game where whenever you pick up an object or you enter an area and the game immediately tutorializes the solution for you, it takes out any ability of you for you as a player to solve that problem and to feel like you're crucial to the solution. And I think Exile nailed that feeling, but the cost of it was that it repelled a large percentage of its audience who didn't want to sit down and spend enough time, as you said earlier about Elite, figuring out the nuances of the various systems.
I think on the one hand you need to find a perfect balance of trying to bring in new players and at the same time not hold their hand too much. Like I think, like I seen the first level on YouTube earlier, and then I was kind of sort of impressed that okay, you can go in immediately, but at the other hand, I was just thinking, where's the tutorial for this thing? Like, it's just going to kill players.
I think that's it. It's a tough question as a developer to answer for yourself about how much work you think a player should do to uncover the great parts of your game, because if you put too much out there, I think, then you end up in a button tunnel or, worse, a visual novel where you just press X to watch mediocre cutscenes. But on the flip side, if it's just this dense web of systems that nobody understands, then no one's actually going to enjoy, the game that you've built. So it's an ongoing debate on virtually every game I've ever worked on about how much tutorialization to put in and, how much hand holding to put in. And then just the realization at some point that you have to pick your audience, that some people are going to not like your game, depending on which decision you make. So are you on a giant franchise that spend a lot of money where you're obliged to appeal to, tens of millions of people, or are you, keeping your budget tight and therefore you can be a bit more obnoxious and say it's okay if, a chunk of the mainstream don't like it because I'm trying to really impress essentially, for me at least, the 12-year-old version of yourself.
Like, what is your perfect philosophy of what a good tutorial could be?
For me, it's sort of like once you pick it up, you should be in a situation where you can, toy around with it and learn the limits of the mechanics. So, if you fall into a hole, there's a rock in the hole and a button high above your head. Then you can't really get out until you figure out that you need to throw the rock at that button, and then you can get out. And then from then you're like, oh, great, I can throw rocks. Buttons react to physics. I have two pieces of information that I can use to move forward. And then if you do it right, then the game, sort of onion layers out again, and then you would add buttons, rocks, and, another piece of equipment for the player, or another, situation in which you could use that rock. So if you could do that, I would be super excited. And then, you can even go further and say that once you have the sort of core abilities, maybe you just drop new things which share parts of those abilities, into the player's hands and let them just figure it out freeform. But yeah, I think trial and error and letting the player, be the intelligent one instead of the game is the way to go.
There's another aspect to my kind of sci-fi obsession question, which I nearly forgot to ask, and like, how did Exile kind of help you with your sci-fi itch, so to speak? How did that kind of satisfy that itch?
It sort of, for me, it was hitting the urge to just explore a new place. I think video games or science fiction or comic books often share that sort of escapist fantasy of a lot of us who are in small towns or young and don't have any money or freedom at the time. So it's a way to sort of stretch your legs and see what else could be out there. So it was that idea of being somewhere utterly alien, and actually being the agent of change, being the person that can explore that place, figure it out, and do it on your own, which at sort of 12, 13 was a super powerful fantasy.
That kind of super escapism.
Yeah, exactly.
Like, what other games that for the time, like the Amiga, that kind of caught your eye in terms of the kind of exploration that it gave you, that kind of open freedom, besides Exile, that got it? Yeah.
Well, I mean, the biggest one for me was more actually was once we went across to sort of Super Nintendo. So the same period, but sort of Super Metroid was very much that same feeling of using your skills with a better tutorial, which I think is probably getting back to your earlier question, was one of the big deltas. Like Metroid never used physics, so it was much more precise, and you could actually learn it and repeat your actions more. So Exile was a bit more hardcore. It was on a system that wasn't outside of Europe as popular, and that franchise is still going strong today.
It's interesting that you mentioned Super Metroid, because Exile is very heavily Metroidvania designed. Like it's
Yep.
it's one of the earlier instances of Metroidvania. Like how did you find that for its time, anyways?
Oh, I thought it was amazing. I you know that again, if you remember that, it wasn't that much earlier that that a video game was designed just to take your money. So that, you know what I mean? Like the idea of finishing it at all was a new idea. And then after that, the idea that you could finish it in a non-linear fashion was really eye-opening. Because again, it is one of the even though your actions in a video game obviously are inherently linear when you go back through them, the idea that you are continually given a choice is one of its great differentiating features between any sort of passive media. So the idea that you're standing at the start of the game, and that you can turn around, like one of the great revelations in early Mario games, and go backwards, and that the game might reward you for that, or you might find a secret or something you didn't know. For me, was revelatory.
What other Metroidvania games could have stood out for you? Obviously, Super Metroid, but like what others for the time, anyways?
I didn't find many of those Castlevania is obviously the other big one, but that sort of came a bit later. Some of the early Castlevanias were pretty linear, but that was probably the other big popular one.
I think for me, my only kind of Metroidvania experience has been Shadow Complex, so I should really fix that.
Shadow Complex is a great one. The other one, Guacamelee, is actually amazing. You should play that.
Yes, and Metroid Samus Returns as well. Do it properly as well.
Yep.
Have you played Metroid Samus Returns yet?
I have not. I have it sitting here in a giant stack of games on my desk. So I have masses of comics, books, games that I need to get to, and my 5-year-old is a large obstacle to getting through my backlog.
Oh no!
I'm very excited because I think he's already playing a bit of the Lego, the sort of Lego Marvel superhero stuff, and he can get that. I think in about 2 years, when I'm allowed to play co-op, decent co-op with him, I think then we'll make some progress.
Very, very, very exciting time. In the meantime, just get as much of the backlog done now between now and Christmas.
Yeah, exactly. He's in daycare right now, so I can go finish Prey after we get off this Skype.
Fantastic. I really no, I'm not touching Prey. Dear God, no. I'm not. It's too scary for me. It's too scary for me. BioShock I can take. Everything else, nope. So this is going to seem very short in comparison to the other games, but like. What else do you like about Exile that we've not touched upon?
There's lots of stuff. I mean, just little stuff like the simple combinations of mechanics. Like you can go around. If you explore it, you could find like a bottle. If you take the bottle, you can use real world logic. So you find a stream, you drop the bottle in, the bottle fills with water. And then if you were paying attention, there was a flame somewhere else that you could then go and drop the bottle filled with water on it, and it actually does what you would think. And so I'm a big fan of, we talked about tutorialization before. We haven't talked about interface, but usually, interface is something you put in when your game doesn't make sense. In the real world, we don't need, I don't need guiding lines to see where I'm going to put my hand because it all works. But it's logical to me to perform the sequence of actions to get the result that I want. In a game, we put interface in because it's illogical. So any game where you can actually use real world logic to dodge interface and make a tutorial rewarding in that it obeys natural logic, for me is super exciting.
Actually, just slightly go back. You had mentioned the kind of unique physics aspect of that mechanics at the time, and like it does what it says in the tin. You find a bottle of water, you fill it up. There's a fire on the other side. Pour the water on top of the fire. There you go. Simple answer, Obvious answer. Fire goes out. Like that was pretty far out there for its time, I would say.
Oh, it was huge. Yeah, I didn't see another game that executed that for years. After that. So no, it's. I mean, these are the things that you remember. I find that, I remember emotions and the first time I came across mechanics and surprise in video games, a lot. These are the things that stick with you, not the sort of fact that Exile is also, incredibly fiddly. Like the physics model is not very robust, and you spend a lot of time bouncing off walls and being kind of a virtual idiot. But the things that stick with me are those aha moments that they pioneered.
What was the game after Exile that you first kind of discovered those kind of the amazing physics mechanics again? Like the first game that made you go, "Wow, this reminds me a lot of Exile."
Gosh, I don't know. Like there haven't been too many. I'm just thinking in terms of. I mean, these days, it's sort of embedded in everything. Like when we made Far Cry, there's a lot of bouncing your car down a cliff to explode against the bottom, and sort of there's a lot of that sort of stuff that's in there by definition. But gosh, back in those days, it probably was flight sims. You mentioned flight sims before, but they were some of the games that were really using physics models. So maybe X-wing or TIE Fighter back in the day were super good. Some of the early, Ultima Underworld titles were great. Not so much physics, but that combinatoric sort of nature and the openness that Exile had. I was a big fan of Ultima Underworld 1 and 2.
What didn't you like about it?
It's kind of, the movement is kind of spastic. Like, you can see why they loved this physics model, but it was hard to master. It was I never felt completely comfortable moving the character around. So sometimes that moment in a video game where you fail not because you didn't know what to do, but because the game felt like it cheated you slightly. So these were some of the things that sort of bothered me at the time, but and probably some of the things that made sort of a mass audience bounce off it as well.
What would you change from a design perspective? I would assume two of those things being, like you said, the spastic movement and the fixing the lack of a tutorial.
I wouldn't put a tutorial in so much as I would have a few little moments that were more encapsulated and would allow you to learn the mechanics just early on, even just for a few of the little ones, because at the time the big learning was that would work. Like other games, it just none of the things that did work in Exile worked in any game. So it was this amazingly new thing that I don't think people realized because they applied the sort of their existing thought processes to it and got no results. Whereas if you saw someone else play it, like if you had a friend at school or, something who would say, oh, no, do this and this, and give you the sort of initial, entry into it, you had, an infinitely better experience with the game. So just some little structured moments early on to give players an inroad into the complex systems, I think would help a lot.
It's a bit weird to ask you top 3 Exile games, because I don't think there's been 3 Exile games. So, let's say top 3 Amiga games. Obviously Exile at the top, but how would you rank 2 and 3?
Oh gosh, it's super hard. These questions are always incredibly difficult to answer because there's so many that I like. I don't know. I think we could go with favorite because best is so difficult to answer. The ones that had the biggest impact on me, even though weirdly I hate sports games, I will put Sensible Soccer up there as one game that I had a huge amount of fun with. And then probably just for I go with Chaos Engine as another one as the two big ones that I loved.
I was going to say as well, like you said you weren't a big sports fan or sports game fan at the time. Were you a big sports fan at the time?
It's funny, not a huge one. I love Australian rules football. When I left Australia, one of the reasons I didn't watch for a long time was because it's a sport only played, in Australia. It's very parochial and very sort of, has kind of a small town vibe to it. And ironically, that's the reason I love it now. That it's not one of these mega sports that it is only played by one country. So I watch a lot of that. I still like a bit of the cricket. But yeah, apart from that, not so much.
So basically the fact that it is so parochial, like you said, it just helps that kind of maybe homesick feeling.
Yeah, it's nicely small town. You know what I mean? Like it's therefore relatively free of sort of all the dodginess of international sport. In that sort of there's no point to it. So yeah, I do like the small town nature of it.
And then you've got the international series as well of Ireland.
Yes, which was always fun. There was actually a really good couple of games this year. Did you watch it?
I've not seen them yet. No.
They were actually fun. They were the last game especially was particularly tight. There's always a strange level of feeling in it for a sport that no one ever plays. It's like once every 2 years they get up. There's always a bit of biffo in it.
Honorable mentions, go for it.
So there's so many like we go doing. So we mentioned before. I think just sensible soccer for its ability to capture the essence of a sport that I otherwise wouldn't like, and give you enough screen real estate to get the joy of passing and setting up a shot. SimCity for the sort of simulated universe that's invisible under the hood in that game that gave me the feeling that it was alive, kind of like goofing around with a petri dish. What else? Zelda: Ocarina of Time, just for creating a world and an openness and a sense of exploration, which I hadn't had until that point. Same vibe, sort of Super Mario 64 for just rewarding everything. Like everything that you did that you thought would be difficult, if you managed to do it, they'd figured it out before you and put a reward there, which was truly terrific. Ultimate Underworld for being a super immersive, role-playing game that again seemed to have, its own set of, world rules that it didn't break that let you sort of play around with it. What else? Civilization, the whole franchise, just for its sort of Moorish nature, that idea that you're always, one move away from, building something, attacking someone, or, receiving, an interesting problem to solve. So you just can't put it down. What else? There must be more. I'm surrounded by games. I'm sitting in my office. There's so many. Recently, actually, I'll give a shout out to a game that just blew me away recently. Divinity: Original Sin, for being an isometric RPG that was completely finished, which sounds like an odd thing to say, but it was a brilliant story. It was an open world. You can kill or save whoever you want. You can complete most objectives in a myriad ways. Just a completely brilliant game. I was super impressed by that one.
You mentioned Ocarina of Time and Super Mario 64. It'd be amiss of me if I didn't talk about or didn't ask about Breath of the Wild and Super Mario Odyssey. Like you mentioned Breath of the Wild earlier, but how did you find those games?
Yep. I just got off a long plane flight and I played Mario the whole way, and it's the first Mario since probably Sunshine that I really actually loved. And I think it's just a terrific game. It gives me back that sense of exploration that Mario 64 and Mario Sunshine had, that sort of Galaxy and other recent sort of new Super Mario Brothers had lost, in my opinion. Breath of the Wild, I can't crack. I'll say it. I feel great shame. I'm the guy that owns every Zelda in a box ever made. I have all the sort of Game Boy, whether they're DS or DSi, Zelda special editions, and Breath of the Wild at the moment I just can't get into. I've got to sit down and give it another shot. But I found it kind of rough around the edges compared to all the other Zeldas, which is interesting. I found that when I was solving a problem, sometimes I thought I was cheesing it instead of being smart about it. I ended up stuck in situations where it felt like I was supposed to have understood a mechanic that I hadn't even come across yet, and I couldn't get out of. I got out of one area because I realized I could load up, charges to launch myself, but I only knew because of a tip in a load screen after I died 3 times, and that felt sort of arbitrary. So I struggled a bit with the new Zelda, but everyone whose opinion I respect loves it, so I'm gonna have to go back in and play again.
No, fair enough. No, I mean, like, as someone who's gone into it with, like, I don't know, like, minus 10 hours so with combined Zelda games, I loved it. I loved it. It's actually not my game of the year, to be honest. Yet, even
What's your game of the year?
Nier Automata.
Nier Automata?
Nier Automata.
Oh, okay, yeah.
Which is a bit weird. They kind of put it like that, but it is phenomenal. I loved it. I love it so much. But Breath of the Wild is incredible. But yeah, I want to touch upon something that you said from Mario as well, because that's interesting. Because you said it's the first Mario game since Sunshine that you kind of really clicked with. That's really interesting because there's I don't know if I would say a lot of hate for Sunshine, but at the same time, Sunshine's not looked upon very fondly, let's say.
Yeah, I know, and that always blew me away. I loved Sunshine. I thought it was really terrific. I thought that the sort of new big mechanic that they built that one around, which was sort of the water gun. The new one's built around sort of like the hat that possesses creatures. I thought it was terrific. I actually never understood where the hate came from in that franchise, but it was the opposite for me. I felt Galaxy was very constrained and small and vaguely linear, and I didn't like it anywhere near as much.
That's and the fact that I'm guessing that's why you liked Mario Odyssey so much, because like it is a game that harkens back to the Sunshine era of 3D kind of platform and Mario magic at its core.
Yeah, and you just you are actually I mean, for me, I guess one of the core elements that'll make me love a game versus become bored by it, and this is why I will go back and try Breath of the Wild again, is the idea that I am the agent of change and that I, as the player, am free to pick my direction of exploration and then the tools that I'm going to use. And so the idea that I start a level and I can run off in any direction, for me is one of the joys of video games. So Odyssey definitely has that in spades.
Top 3 games ever, what would they be? Obviously, I was going to say Exile at the top, but how would you rank 2 and 3? Like, how would you rate them?
Gosh, it's so hard. Whatever I say, I feel that I will be like if I say modern games, because realistically most of them, even though Exile is terrific, if we were to say best game, it wouldn't be. It would be
the metric for this top 3 would be favorite games. I say best would be more a kind of broad stroke of sorts.
Okay. Yep. All right. So favorite, I would say Exile, Ultima 7, The Black Gate, which made me buy a PC for the first time and put my Amiga under the bed. The shame. What would be number 3? I probably would have to say Zelda: Ocarina of Time. Yeah. There you go.
Fair enough.
And I've insulted so many games now.
Oh God, no! You will have to go into hiding now. Especially now that we found out the game that was the game that kind of put away your Amiga once and for all.
Yep. Well, Richard Garriott, he's a fascinating character. He also owns several castles.
All the doggo's going off.
Oh, hang on.
No.
I'm getting a package. We just started our own company, Typhoon Studios, earlier this year, so hopefully we'll be able to announce something at this year's E3, so keep your eyes open for that. And if you would like to hear any of my random rantings and ramblings, you can follow me on Twitter at BangBangClick, and I'll be putting things there when I'm allowed to put things there.
Almost like kind of sniper, just kind of aiming a gun at you, just say, don't put this there until I...
Just leave it. I'll just leave it there and then turn off the computer.
Thanks for listening to My Favourite Game, a podcast on PlayDiaries.com where people in the games industry talk of their favourite game. If you want to listen to future episodes of My Favourite Game or other Play Diaries podcasts, press play early. You can join our $4 tier on Patreon at patreon.com/playdiaries. Next up, Nels Anderson on Thief. Until then, thanks for listening. Bye bye.